Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most chilling and confounding criminal investigations in American history. A predator who terrorized California for over a decade, vanished without a trace, and then, 40 years later, was identified in his own backyard, sitting in his driveway, by investigators who had never stopped looking. Here's what happened. Imagine you are a detective. It is 1979. You have a serial offender who has struck over 50 times. He is meticulous. He is cunning. He leaves almost nothing behind. And then, one day, he simply stops. No arrest. No dramatic confrontation. No closure for the families and survivors who have lived with the weight of what he did every single day. He just disappears into ordinary life, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would take law enforcement nearly 4 decades to fully unravel. That detective's nightmare was real. It was shared by dozens of law enforcement agencies across 6 California counties. And the man at the center of it, the man they were hunting, was living quietly, just miles from some of his earliest crimes, working as a police officer himself. That man's name is Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. And tonight on True Crime Mysteries, we are going to walk through every chapter of this case. The crimes, the decades of dead ends, the families who refused to let the world forget, the retired investigators who kept working even after their careers ended, and the extraordinary scientific breakthrough that finally brought one of the most prolific unidentified offenders in American history to justice. This is the story of the Golden State Killer. The mystery. Let's begin with the question that haunted California law enforcement for nearly 40 years. Not just who was he, but how? How does a person commit over 100 burglaries, more than 50 sexual assaults, and 13 murders across multiple California counties, striking over the span of 12 years, and leave behind no usable fingerprints? No witnesses who could identify him. No reliable physical description beyond the vague and contradictory accounts that survivors, frightened and traumatized, tried their best to provide. How does someone do all of that and simply walk away? The short answer, based on everything we know from public records and court documents, is that this offender was extraordinarily disciplined. He planned his attacks in advance. He conducted surveillance on neighborhoods and victims before he ever made a move. He wore gloves. He controlled crime scenes. He understood, perhaps better than most people alive in the 1970s, what evidence meant and how to minimize it. And yet, he made one mistake. The one mistake that no amount of planning, no amount of discipline, could ever fully prevent. He left behind his DNA. And while the science did not yet exist to identify him when he committed his crimes, that science was coming. And when it arrived, fully, powerfully, and in ways even its creators had not fully anticipated, it would reach back across 4 decades and pull Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. out of the shadows of ordinary suburban life and into a courtroom in Sacramento. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the magnitude of how this case was finally solved, you first have to understand the magnitude of what was done, and what investigators were up against for so many years. Context. To understand the Golden State Killer case, we have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is not a single event. It is a pattern, a slow, escalating pattern that investigators across California would not fully recognize as the work of one person until decades after it was over. The year is 1974. The location is Visalia, California, a small city in the San Joaquin Valley, about 200 miles southeast of San Francisco. Someone is breaking into homes. Not in the smash and grab style that most burglars favor. This person is quiet, methodical. He takes small items, sometimes items of little obvious monetary value. He rearranges things inside homes. He seems to know which houses are occupied and which are not. Local investigators linked at least 120 burglaries in the Visalia area to a single unidentified suspect, who would later be referred to in case files as the Visalia ransacker. At the time, no one connected those crimes to anything larger. They were significant locally, but Visalia was a long way from the places where this person would later strike. Then, in 1975, the burglaries turned deadly. A young man named Claude Snelling was shot and killed in Visalia in September of that year when he interrupted an apparent attempted abduction. That murder would, decades later, be attributed to DeAngelo through DNA and investigative evidence, though it would take the better part of 4 decades for that connection to be formally established. By 1976, the activity had shifted northward, to Sacramento County. And in Sacramento, the crimes took on a new and devastating character. Beginning in the summer of 1976 and continuing through 1979, an unidentified man committed a series of sexual assaults in Sacramento County and surrounding areas. He would later be known as the East Area Rapist. Based on court records and public investigative files, investigators attributed at least 51 sexual assaults to him during this period. The East Area Rapist's methods followed a recognizable pattern. He targeted suburban neighborhoods. He would often call victims or their neighbors in the days or weeks before an attack, investigators believe as part of his surveillance routine. He broke into occupied homes at night. He brought his own restraints. He demanded compliance, threatened violence, and he knew how to control a scene. Investigators at the time described their frustration at every turn. Composite sketches were distributed. Tip lines received thousands of calls. Surveillance operations were conducted in neighborhoods where he was expected to strike again. And yet, he continued. Neighborhood watch programs formed in response to his activity. Residents armed themselves. The Sacramento area community lived in genuine fear for years. And then, in 1979, the East Area Rapist murders began. 2 people were killed in Sacramento County, a development that raised the investigative stakes dramatically. But here is where the story takes one of its more bewildering turns. Around the same time, a different series of crimes began appearing in Southern California, in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. These crimes were murders, targeting couples in their homes. The attacker's methods were sophisticated and brutal. He left almost no usable forensic evidence. This offender was known as the original Night Stalker, not to be confused with Richard Ramirez, who was separately dubbed the Night Stalker by the press and is a different individual entirely. The original Night Stalker, as investigators referred to him, was linked to at least 10 homicides in Southern California between 1979 and 1986. 2 killers, 2 jurisdictions, 2 separate investigative teams, 2 separate case files, no apparent connection, for 22 years. In 2001, the California Department of Justice and the FBI applied advanced DNA testing to evidence collected at crime scenes attributed to both the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. The results were definitive and staggering. The DNA was a match. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Law enforcement now referred to the combined offender as EARONS, an acronym built from both designations. But it would be another decade before the public would know this person by the name that has become most widely associated with the case today. That name, the Golden State Killer, was coined not by a law enforcement official, but by a crime writer named Michelle McNamara. McNamara, who was the wife of comedian and actor Patton Oswalt, became deeply invested in the unsolved EARONS case in the early 2010s. She wrote about it extensively on her true crime blog, True Crime Diary, and began working on a book about the case. She coined the name Golden State Killer in a 2013 article for Los Angeles Magazine, arguing that the case deserved a name that reflected the full geographic and human scope of what this individual had done across California. The name stuck. Law enforcement agencies began adopting it, and as the name spread, so did public awareness of a case that had been largely forgotten outside of the communities it had directly affected. Tragically, Michelle McNamara did not live to see the case solved. She died in April 2016, at the age of 46, before Joseph James DeAngelo was identified and arrested. Her book, titled All Be Gone in the Dark, was completed posthumously by her researchers and collaborators and published in 2018, just months after DeAngelo's arrest. Her work, and the work of the many survivors, families, and investigators who never stopped pressing for answers, helped create the conditions that made his arrest possible. But the technical breakthrough that actually delivered that arrest, that came from a direction that almost no one had anticipated. The investigation. Now let's get into the investigative timeline, because this is where the story of the Golden State Killer becomes one of the most remarkable true crime investigations ever conducted. Not just because of the enormity of the crimes, but because of the sheer persistence of the people who pursued this case through decade after decade of dead ends, scientific limitations, and institutional obstacles. When the East Area Rapist first began his attacks in Sacramento in 1976, DNA forensics as we understand them today simply did not exist. DNA profiling, the technique of analyzing biological material to create an individual genetic identifier, would not be developed until the 1980s. The first criminal conviction based on DNA evidence in the United States came in 1988. By that time, the Golden State Killer had already gone dormant. So investigators working the East Area rapist cases in the late 1970s had to rely on what was available to them: witness descriptions, physical evidence collected at crime scenes, shoe impressions, psychological profiles, and the collective knowledge of detectives who were among the best at their work. They were not working with outdated methods out of incompetence. They were working at the frontier of what criminal investigation could accomplish in their era. And yet, the case remained open. As DNA technology developed through the late 1980s and 1990s, investigators began revisiting old evidence from the Golden State Killer's crimes. Crime scenes had yielded biological evidence, and by the mid-1990s, forensic laboratories could analyze that evidence and produce a DNA profile of the unknown suspect. This was significant. It meant that if Joseph James DeAngelo's DNA had ever been collected, whether because he was arrested, convicted, or voluntarily submitted a sample, investigators would have had a match. But it had not been. And because it had not been, the DNA profile sat in a database, a perfect genetic fingerprint belonging to a name that no one yet knew. The 2001 DNA confirmation that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person represented an enormous investigative leap. It meant that a single suspect was responsible for crimes that had previously been investigated as separate cases by separate jurisdictions. It meant that the physical and behavioral evidence from all of those cases could now be combined and analyzed together. And it meant that a single arrest, whenever it came, would solve a staggering number of open cases at once. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database maintained by the FBI that allows law enforcement agencies to compare crime scene DNA against profiles collected from known offenders. Nothing matched. The man behind the Golden State Killer's crimes had never been entered into the system. In 2016, the FBI and local law enforcement agencies made a public announcement renewing their call for information in the case. A reward of $50,000 was offered for information leading to the identification of the offender. The announcement generated significant media coverage and a new wave of tips. Former Sacramento County District Attorney Jan Scully and other officials made public statements emphasizing that the case remained very much an active investigation. It was around this time that the investigative team began seriously exploring a relatively new and largely untested approach to identifying unknown suspects using DNA. That approach was called investigative genetic genealogy. Here is how it works. In the consumer genealogy boom of the 2010s, companies like 23andMe and AncestryDNA invited people to submit saliva samples and receive reports about their ancestry and genetic heritage. Some of those people also uploaded their DNA data to open-access genealogy databases that anyone could access and compare against. The purpose was to help people find relatives they did not know they had. It was a tool for family reunions and genealogical research. But investigators realized something remarkable about these databases. If a crime scene DNA profile, a profile belonging to an unknown suspect, were uploaded to one of these databases, it might return matches to relatives of that suspect. Not the suspect himself, necessarily, but cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who shared enough genetic material with the unknown suspect that a skilled genealogist could begin building a family tree. And by working through that family tree, ruling out branches, following others, it might be possible to eventually narrow the field of candidates down to a small number of individuals. And from there, investigators could use traditional methods, surveillance, comparison, confirmation, to identify the right person. The investigative team working the Golden State Killer case brought in a forensic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter to help with this process. Ray Venter had a background in law and biology, and she had previously used genetic genealogy to help identify remains and solve other investigative problems. She would later be named among Time magazine's 100 most influential people of 2019 for her work on this case. The crime scene DNA profile from the Golden State Killer case was uploaded to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch. GEDmatch was a free service that allowed users to upload DNA data from various testing platforms and compare it against other users' data. It was open access, meaning that anyone, including law enforcement, could upload a profile and run comparisons. The upload returned distant matches. Not the suspect himself, but relatives, people who shared enough DNA with the unknown offender to suggest they were connected within a few generations. Now, here's where the patience and skill of the investigative genealogy process becomes extraordinary. Ray Venter and her colleagues did not simply have a name. They had a starting point. And from that starting point, they had to build family trees, sometimes going back generations, to find the common ancestor connecting the DNA matches to each other and potentially to the unknown suspect. They had to then trace those family trees forward in time, identifying descendants who would have been the right age to be the suspect. They had to cross-reference geographic information. Where did the descendants of these family trees live? Were they in California? Were any of them connected to the areas where the crimes occurred? This process took months of careful, meticulous work, genealogical detective work of the highest order, conducted using public records, obituaries, census data, and DNA comparisons. And it led investigators to a family. And within that family, to a name. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., born November 8, 1945, a resident of Citrus Heights, California, a suburb of Sacramento. A former police officer. Let that land for a moment. A former police officer. DeAngelo had served as a police officer in Exeter, California, in the early 1970s, in the San Joaquin Valley, the same region where the Visalia ransacker burglaries occurred. He later joined the Auburn Police Department in Placer County, California. He was dismissed from the Auburn Police Department in 1979, the same year the East Area rapist attacks in Sacramento appeared to be winding down and the Southern California homicides attributed to the original Night Stalker were beginning. Public records indicate that DeAngelo was fired from the Auburn Police Department after being arrested for shoplifting, specifically for stealing a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. That arrest generated a newspaper report at the time. It was a small, seemingly minor incident, but it ended his law enforcement career. And here is where I want to stop and ask you something, because this is one of the aspects of this case that people find most difficult to process. Think about this. Joseph James DeAngelo, if the evidence in his own subsequent guilty plea are to be believed, spent years as a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, while simultaneously committing the crimes that would make him one of the most wanted unidentified offenders in American history. He understood police procedure. He understood investigations. He understood evidence and how it was collected. Does knowing that change how you think about this case? Does it explain some of the discipline and tactical awareness that investigators observed in the crime scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Now, back to 2018. Investigators had a name, but a name generated through genealogical inference is not a legal identification. It is not a match confirmed by a crime lab. It is a hypothesis. A very strong hypothesis supported by careful scientific and genealogical work, but a hypothesis nonetheless. To confirm that Joseph James DeAngelo was their man, investigators needed to obtain a DNA sample from him directly and compare it against the crime scene profile. They needed to do this without alerting him, and they needed to do it legally. This is where law enforcement's surveillance operation became critical. Investigators from the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office, the FBI, and multiple other agencies established surveillance on DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights. They watched. They waited, and at some point, DeAngelo discarded an item. Accounts in press materials and court reporting reference that investigators recovered what is described as DNA material that DeAngelo had discarded in a public place, making its collection legally permissible without a warrant under what is known as the abandoned DNA doctrine. That sample was sent to a forensic laboratory. The results came back. It was a match. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., age 72, a retired grandfather living in a suburban home in Citrus Heights, California, was the Golden State Killer. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement moved. DeAngelo was arrested in the driveway of his home. There was no dramatic standoff. No vehicle chase. No last-minute flight. He was simply there, in the driveway of a house in a quiet suburb, and they took him into custody. The arrest made international headlines within hours. For the investigators who had worked the case for years and decades, it was a moment many had believed might never come. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert, who had been instrumental in the renewed investigative push, spoke at a press conference about the arrest, describing the investigative genealogy process and confirming DeAngelo's identity as the Golden State Killer suspect. The law enforcement community's reaction was a mixture of vindication, relief, and something more complicated: the knowledge that answers had finally come, but that no arrest could undo the harm done across those 12 years of crimes. The investigation deepens. Now I want to take a step back and talk about some of the specific investigative details that emerged in the years between 1979, when the crimes stopped, and 2018, when DeAngelo was arrested, because those decades of investigation are not simply a gap. They are filled with the work of dedicated detectives, survivors who participated in the process at great personal cost, and a public awareness campaign that ultimately helped create the conditions for the breakthrough. One of the investigators most closely associated with the long-running Golden State Killer investigation is Paul Holes, a retired investigator from the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office who spent much of his career working cold cases and who became deeply committed to identifying the East Area rapist and original Night Stalker. Holes worked the case for decades and became one of its most public advocates. He retired from law enforcement in March 2018, just days before DeAngelo's arrest. There is something almost poetic about that timing. A man who devoted years of his career to this case stepping away, and then, almost immediately, having the phone ring with the news that the case had been broken. Holes has spoken extensively in press interviews about the investigative challenges the case presented. The sheer geographic spread of the crimes, from the San Joaquin Valley to Sacramento County to the Bay Area to Southern California, meant that the investigation naturally fragmented across multiple jurisdictions. Different sheriff's departments, different district attorney offices, different databases, different filing systems, different investigative cultures. One of the ongoing challenges was simply getting the full picture of what one person had done by assembling information from agencies that had not always communicated directly with one another. The 2001 DNA confirmation that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person was, in that sense, not just a forensic revelation, it was an investigative mandate to begin treating these as connected cases requiring coordinated responses. Another investigator worth noting is Larry Poole, a cold case detective with the Orange County Sheriff's Department who spent years working the original Night Stalker murders in Southern California. Poole was known for maintaining meticulous case files and for reaching out to investigators in other counties to share information about the overlapping crimes. His work contributed to the growing body of compiled evidence that would eventually support the genealogical investigation. And then there are the survivors, men and women who endured attacks attributed to DeAngelo and who, in the decades that followed, continued to participate in the investigation. Some gave repeated interviews to investigators. Some spoke publicly about their experiences in ways that took enormous courage. Some have said that they always believed the offender would eventually be identified. Others had given up hope. All of them deserve to have their participation in this process recognized. Let me pause here and ask you another question, because this is something I think about when I follow cases like this one. Forensic genealogy, the technique that cracked this case, was new enough in 2018 that there were virtually no legal guidelines governing its use. Barbara Ray Venter and the investigative team were navigating largely uncharted territory. The database they used, GEDmatch, had terms of service that were intended for personal use. The question of whether law enforcement could upload an unknown offender's DNA to a platform designed for civilian genealogical research raised legal and ethical questions that courts and legislators are still working through. Some legal scholars have raised privacy concerns about the technique, arguing that when people upload their DNA to a genealogy database, they are also, in a sense, uploading DNA information about their relatives who never consented to be in any database. What do you think? Was the use of forensic genealogy to catch the Golden State Killer the right call? Does the severity of the crimes change your answer? Or do you think that the privacy questions raised by this technique deserve to be taken seriously regardless of who the target is? Put your thoughts in the comments. This is genuinely one of the most important debates in modern criminal justice, and it's one that this case puts squarely at the center of public conversation. The significance of the evidence. Let's talk about the DNA evidence itself, because it is central to understanding why this case was eventually solvable and also why it took so long. DNA evidence from the Golden State Killer's crimes had been collected and preserved, in some cases for decades. The ability to preserve biological evidence from crime scenes and then apply emerging technology to that evidence as it became available is one of the key lessons that law enforcement agencies took from this case. Had that evidence been destroyed or discarded in the 1980s or 1990s, the 2018 breakthrough would never have happened. The Golden State Killer investigation also directly contributed to the establishment of California's DNA database. California's DNA database, which collects DNA from accused and convicted felons, was, in part, a policy response to the recognition that DNA evidence was only as useful as the database against which it could be compared. The East Area rapist's crime scene DNA sat in a database for years without a match because DeAngelo had never been in the system. Building more comprehensive DNA databases was seen as a way to prevent future cases from languishing in the same way. That policy debate continues today, with arguments on both sides about how broadly DNA collection authorities should extend and what safeguards should exist to protect the civil liberties of people who have not been convicted of any crime. But in the Golden State Killer case specifically, what ultimately closed the gap was not the expansion of a criminal database. It was the use of a civilian database, GEDmatch, in a way that its creators had never specifically anticipated. And that is what makes the investigative genealogy technique so significant and so consequential for law enforcement going forward. Let's also take a moment to talk about the scope of the crimes themselves, because I want to make sure that the human scale of this case is fully clear. According to court records and public investigative files, the crimes attributed to Joseph James DeAngelo span from at least 1974 to 1986. That is 12 years. Over that 12-year period, investigators attribute to him at minimum 120 burglaries, and that is likely a conservative count. At least 51 sexual assaults. And 13 murders. Those numbers can sometimes obscure what they represent. Behind each of those numbers is a person. Someone who went about their daily life, who had no idea they were being watched or targeted, and who endured something that no person should ever have to endure. Some of the people in those numbers did not survive, and those who did carried what happened to them for the rest of their lives. One of the things that stands out in reporting on the Golden State Killer case is how many survivors and family members of victims chose to speak publicly, not just about their own experiences, but about the investigative process and about their feelings toward the judicial proceedings. That kind of sustained civic engagement, over decades, is itself a form of courage, and it played a meaningful role in keeping public and official attention on the case. The legal proceedings. Now let's turn to the courtroom. Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested on April 24, 2018, and charged with multiple counts of murder. He was held without bail. At his initial court appearances, he made no statements. He had an attorney, and the legal process, as it always does, moved slowly and deliberately. The charges against DeAngelo were substantial. Multiple California County District Attorney offices, Sacramento, Orange, Ventura, Santa Barbara, and others, had jurisdiction over various crimes attributed to him. Coordinating charges across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own laws and prosecutorial priorities, was itself a complex legal undertaking. In the end, the case was resolved not through a trial but through a negotiated guilty plea. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo appeared before Sacramento County Superior Court Judge Michael Bowman and pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and numerous other charges related to the crimes to which he admitted. The plea deal was structured in a way that gave survivors and family members of victims an opportunity to be heard before sentencing. The hearings that preceded formal sentencing were notable for the number of survivors and victims' family members who appeared, in person and via video, to address DeAngelo directly. Those proceedings, which took place over multiple days in August 2020, were held at a large venue, California State University, Sacramento, to accommodate social distancing requirements due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as to allow for the large number of participants. Judge Bowman presided. Survivor after survivor, family member after family member, stood before the court and said what they needed to say, to the court, to each other, and to DeAngelo, who sat in the courtroom and heard every word. The accounts that emerged in those hearings, preserved in court records and covered extensively by news organizations, reflected the breadth of harm caused across decades. People who had been children when their parents were taken from them. People who had survived attacks and spent decades rebuilding their lives. People who had spent years as advocates for cold case attention and DNA database legislation. And then DeAngelo himself spoke. In a brief statement at the sentencing hearing, Joseph James DeAngelo said, in court, "I have listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I am truly sorry to everyone I have hurt." Court records and news coverage reflect that his statement was brief. Some who were present described it as insufficient. Others said that nothing he could say would ever be sufficient. On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will never leave prison. He was 74 years old at the time of his sentencing. The broader impact. The arrest, prosecution, and sentencing of Joseph James DeAngelo did not resolve every legal question raised by the investigation. But it set in motion a broader conversation about several issues that continue to resonate through law enforcement, the legal community, and society as a whole. The first is the issue of forensic genealogy and its future in criminal investigations. The Golden State Killer case was, in many respects, the breakthrough moment for investigative genetic genealogy as a law enforcement tool. After the DeAngelo arrest, news reports began emerging about other cold cases being solved using similar techniques. The DNA Project, a nonprofit organization that uses genetic genealogy to identify unidentified remains, expanded its work significantly in the wake of heightened public awareness. But the technique also prompted regulatory responses. GEDmatch, the platform used in the DeAngelo investigation, subsequently changed its terms of service to make law enforcement access opt-in rather than default, meaning that only users who specifically agreed to allow law enforcement searches would have their data available for that purpose. This change reduced the size of the searchable pool for future investigations. And it raised the fundamental question of how law enforcement's use of civilian genetic data should be regulated going forward. In 2019, the Department of Justice released interim guidelines for the use of forensic genealogy in federal investigations, attempting to establish standards for when and how the technique could be employed. Some states enacted their own regulations. The legal and ethical framework around forensic genealogy remains, as of this writing, a developing and contested area of law. The second issue raised by this case is the question of evidence preservation. The biological evidence from the Golden State Killer crime scenes was collected and preserved by investigators in the 1970s and 1980s who could not have known precisely how that evidence would eventually be used, because the technology to use it in the way it was ultimately used did not yet exist. Their decision to preserve that evidence, carefully and systematically, made the 2018 breakthrough possible. It is a powerful argument for rigorous evidence preservation standards and for the principle that what cannot be solved today may be solvable tomorrow. The third issue is the role of public awareness and citizen engagement in cold case investigations. The Golden State Killer case is, in part, a story about what happens when a case is kept alive in public consciousness over time. Michelle McNamara's writing, the 2016 FBI announcement, the renewed media attention, the podcast discussions, all of these created a climate in which the case was not forgotten. And that climate, combined with the scientific capability that emerged through forensic genealogy, created the moment that led to DeAngelo's identification. Public awareness does not solve cases by itself, but it can sustain the institutional will to keep trying. And in a case like this one, where the investigation spanned more than 4 decades, that sustained will mattered enormously. What the record tells us about DeAngelo. Let me be careful here, as I always am on this channel, to stay within what public records actually establish. What the record tells us about Joseph James DeAngelo comes primarily from court documents, including the charges filed against him, the terms of his plea agreement, and the statements made in open court at his sentencing. It also comes from public investigative files released by law enforcement agencies involved in the case, press materials issued by the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office and the FBI, and reporting by news organizations that attended the various court proceedings. DeAngelo was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. He served in the United States Navy. He later earned a degree in criminal justice from California State University, Sacramento. He was a police officer in Exeter, California, where the Visalia ransacker crimes occurred, from approximately 1973 to 1976. He then joined the Auburn Police Department, from which he was dismissed in 1979 after the shoplifting arrest. After leaving law enforcement, DeAngelo worked as a mechanic and later as a truck driver for a grocery distribution company. He lived in the Sacramento area. He had a daughter. By the time of his arrest in 2018, he was living in his Citrus Heights home and appeared, to neighbors and acquaintances, to be a retired grandfather living an ordinary life. Public reporting and court records reflect that investigators and journalists who spoke with people who knew DeAngelo in his later years, neighbors, former acquaintances, described him as someone who inspired no particular suspicion. He was described as quiet, as a neighbor who kept mostly to himself. This is, of course, the aspect of cases like this one that tends to unsettle people most deeply. The idea that someone capable of the things reflected in the public court record could exist in ordinary social spaces, surrounded by people who had no idea, is genuinely disturbing. And it is also, unfortunately, not unusual in the history of serious criminal cases. What the record does not tell us, and what we will not speculate about on this channel, is what was happening in Joseph James DeAngelo's inner life, what his specific motivations were, or what he was thinking during the decades he evaded identification. Those questions may be interesting to consider, but they cannot be answered responsibly by reference to public records alone. What the record tells us is enough. 13 murders, more than 50 sexual assaults, over 100 burglaries, 12 years of criminal activity across 6 California counties, and then 40 years of living as if none of it had happened. Until April 24, 2018, the investigators' WHO never stopped. Before we move toward our conclusion, I want to take a few moments to talk about the human beings who carried this investigation forward over decades, because in the history of true crime, the investigators who work cold cases often work in quiet, without fanfare, and they deserve to be named and recognized. Paul Holes has already been mentioned. Holes has spoken widely in media appearances about the Golden State Killer investigation and about cold case work more broadly. His retirement on March 30, 2018, came just days before the arrest that confirmed the work of his career had not been in vain. Larry Poole, the Orange County cold case detective, spent years working the Southern California homicides and maintaining communication with investigators in other jurisdictions. Richard Shelby, a retired Sacramento County Sheriff's detective who worked the East Area rapist cases in the late 1970s, co-authored a book about the investigation in later years. He remained an advocate for the case long after his retirement. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert was the chief prosecutor who oversaw the office's involvement in the renewed investigation that led to DeAngelo's identification and arrest. She spoke at the press conference announcing the arrest and was present throughout the subsequent legal proceedings. And forensic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, whose scientific and genealogical expertise made the identification possible, represents a new and important category of investigative contributor, the forensic genealogist. Her work on this case not only solved one of the most significant cold cases in American history but also established a template for how forensic genealogy can be ethically and effectively applied in future investigations. These are real people who dedicated real time, in some cases, their entire professional lives, to a case that many people had given up on. And they got there. Resolution and legacy. Let's talk about where things stand today. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. is serving multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole at a California state correctional facility. He was 74 years old at sentencing. Under the terms of his guilty plea and sentence, he will remain incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. The case has been formally designated as solved by all relevant law enforcement agencies. The DNA evidence confirming DeAngelo's identity as the Golden State Killer is part of the public court record. His guilty plea to 13 counts of first-degree murder is part of the public court record. The legacy of this case extends well beyond the DeAngelo prosecution itself. The case sparked a national conversation about forensic genealogy, about the privacy implications of consumer DNA databases, about evidence preservation policies, and about the importance of maintaining investigative resources for cold cases even when solutions seem distant. The book Michelle McNamara had been writing, All Be Gone in the Dark, was published in February 2018, just months before DeAngelo's arrest. It became a #1 New York Times bestseller. A documentary series based on the book aired in 2020 on HBO. McNamara's work reached an audience of millions and played a role, alongside the official investigative push, in keeping the case alive in public consciousness in the years that mattered most. The survivors and family members of victims who participated in the sentencing proceedings have continued, in many cases, to speak publicly about the case and about issues related to it: cold case investigation, DNA legislation, survivor rights. Their ongoing engagement is a reminder that the resolution of a criminal case, however significant, is rarely the full end of the story for the people whose lives were permanently altered by the crimes at the center of it. And for investigators and legal scholars watching from a distance, the case has become something of a landmark, a turning point in the history of forensic science and criminal investigation that will be studied, debated, and built upon for years to come. The final question. Here is the last question I want to leave you with tonight, and it is one that I think gets at something essential about this case. The Golden State Killer operated for 12 years. He was not caught in those 12 years. He was not caught in the 10 years after he stopped. He was not caught in the 20 years after that. He was caught when a new scientific tool, a tool that did not exist when he committed his crimes, was applied to evidence that investigators had carefully preserved for decades, in a way that required not just science but skill and determination and the willingness to think differently about an old problem. What does that tell us? I think it tells us that the tools of justice are still developing. That the evidence preserved today in an apparently unsolvable case may be the key to a solution that emerges 20, 30, or 40 years from now. That the work of investigators, even when it does not produce immediate results, is not wasted. That the sustained attention of survivors, family members, and advocates matters. And it tells us that DNA, that microscopic record of identity carried in every cell of the human body, is a remarkably patient witness. It does not forget, it does not lose its place in a case file. It does not retire, it simply waits. It waited 40 years in the Golden State Killer case. And then it told the truth. Outro. If you have thoughts about the Golden State Killer case, about forensic genealogy, about the role of investigators and survivors in keeping cold cases alive, or about any aspect of what we discussed tonight, drop them in the comments below. We go through every comment, and the conversations that happen on this channel are genuinely some of the most thoughtful I have ever seen. I want to hear what you think. If you found this case compelling and you want more true crime mysteries delivered straight to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Mysteries. Turn on your notifications, because we have new cases coming regularly, and you will not want to miss them. Every case we cover is thoroughly researched from public records, handled with respect for survivors and victims, and presented with the seriousness that these stories deserve. Thank you for watching tonight. The Golden State Killer case is a reminder that even the coldest cases can find resolution, and that the people who keep looking, even when hope is hard to hold onto, are the reason justice is possible at all. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.